The night they lose the Battle of Brandywine, Washington retreats to Chester. The next morning, the army moves up through Darby, crosses the Delaware River where 30th Street Station is today, and marches out to the Germantown area to regroup and resupply. The British during that time make a half-hearted attempt to pursue Washington, not much of anything, but they also send an detachment to occupy Wilmington because that fleet that left them off has to come back around the Delmarva Peninsula, and they need a port for that fleet to dock at. So initially that port is going to be Wilmington. Washington regroups, recrosses the Schuylkill River at Levering's Ford, where Manayunk is today, and marches out roughly what's today US Route 30, and starts to form in what's today known as the Great Valley, general vicinity of where Immaculata College is today. If some of you know these places, you know some landmarks. So the day the British leave, let me see what the next map shows you. Yeah, the day the British leave the Brandywine battlefield, they stayed there for 5 days. They are moving up parallel roads, as shown on this map, towards the South Valley Hills. So the Great Valley, which US Route 30 runs through, is formed by the South Valley Hills and the North Valley Hills. There is a major road intersection in the Great Valley where the White Horse Tavern still stands. It's a private home today. It's a 5-point intersection that has roads leading to all the fords on the Schuylkill River. When Washington lost the Battle of Brandywine, excuse me, the Schuylkill River becomes the last natural defensive barrier for Philadelphia. Because at that time, Philadelphia is not on both sides of the Schuylkill like it is today. It was confined by the peninsula formed by the Schuylkill and the Delaware River, as you can see over here. So Washington wants to block access to all the roads leading to the fords. And he wants to actually get his army up on these South Valley Hills to block access to that road intersection. What neither army realized that day is that the roads that they're using are actually going towards each other, and they're not really expecting to run into each other. And so on September 16th, you get this engagement that becomes known as the Battle of the Clouds, where you have two separate fights on these parallel roads on the South Valley Hills that never develop into a full-scale battle because a major rainstorm breaks out, ruining ammunition on both sides of the field. That's why it's called the Battle of the Clouds. But that created a massive problem for Washington. He had to find a new supply of ammunition. And that new supply of ammunition was way out near Reading Furnace. Now, it's not the city of Reading. It's northwestern Chester County today. But that's where he could get access to a fresh supply of ammunition. So the day after the Battle of the Clouds, the Continental Army hightails it way out to northwestern Chester County. Well, he left behind one division under Anthony Wayne to sort of keep an eye on Howe. Howe moved up into Tredyffrin Township. So if you're familiar with US 202 today, US 202 runs right through Tredyffrin Township right before it gets to like where the Schuylkill Expressway is. Not far from the King of Prussia Mall, roughly. But Howe has to wait for the Schuylkill River to subside. That massive rainstorm created flooding along the Schuylkill. So Howe can't move across the Schuylkill even if he wanted to. During this time, he sends a detachment to Valley Forge. So Valley Forge was a small supply depot at the time. There was a lumber mill there. There was an iron forge there, hence Valley Forge. And there was a warehouse with a bunch of supplies. Washington sent like 8 guys to try to get those supplies ferried across the Schuylkill River. Not enough people to do it. The 2 officers in charge of that operation were Light Horse Harry Lee, who will later become Robert E. Lee's father, and Alexander Hamilton. And the only fighting that ever took place inside Valley Forge Park took place on September 18th when the skirmish erupts during this removal operation. So Howe is now ready to cross the Schuylkill. The problem is he knows from local loyalists that Anthony Wayne is behind him. So he wants to eliminate Anthony Wayne as a threat to his rear before he attempts to cross the Schuylkill. And while he is planning that operation, Washington has now resupplied his army. He has recrossed the Schuylkill at Parker's Ford, where Linfield Limerick Road is, for those of you that may know the roads in the area. And he is now deploying his army on the north side of the Schuylkill between where Phoenixville is today and where Norristown is today. The army is spread out covering all those fords. And then on the night of September 20th and the 21st, Howe launches an attack against Anthony Wayne's camp. It's how you get the Battle of Paoli, or the Massacre of Paoli, which actually took place in the modern town of Malvern and now in the modern town of Paoli. So I know that's a little confusing, but that's the way it is. That's how you get the Battle of Paoli. But with that threat eliminated from his rear, Howe's able to move the whole army up into the Valley Forge area, and he sends a column out what's today Route 23 towards Phoenixville to make Washington think he's heading west, which is a problem for Washington because all of Washington's supplies are out near Reading. And those supplies are far more important in Washington than the city of Philadelphia. So when his scouts pick up Howe moving west, Washington pulls away from all these fords and marches out west to protect Reading, exposing Philadelphia. Howe doesn't want to go near Reading. He stops, reverses course, and on the night of, make sure I got my dates right here, the night of September 23rd, I think is the date, they crossed the Schuylkill River at Fatland Ford, which was directly behind where the George Washington Chapel is in Valley Forge Park today, is where they crossed the river. They then camped that night where Norristown is today. On the 25th, Howe marches into Germantown and establishes a camp. That's how the British end up in Germantown. And then on the morning of the 26th, they send a column under Lord Cornwallis to officially occupy Philadelphia, beginning the 9-month occupation of the city. And then over the next few days, Washington slowly inches from his camp up near Fegleysville down what's roughly today Route 73, eventually ending up in the Worcester area of what's today Montgomery County, camped on the hills around the Peter Wentz farm, which is now a Montgomery County historic site. And that's where Washington will launch the attack on Germantown. Hopefully that didn't take too long. My clock, okay. All right, so that sets up the Battle of Germantown. What's Washington's plan? Well, Washington, from his scouts and his spies, has got a pretty good feel that the army that Howe has camped in Germantown is a shadow of the force that attacked him at Brandywine. Howe attacked at Brandywine with just over 15,000 troops. There are not 15,000 troops camped at Germantown. Howe has sent troops to Wilmington. Howe has sent troops to Chester. Howe has sent troops to occupy Philadelphia. So he has probably less than 10,000 troops actually camped in Germantown. Yes, Washington has suffered casualties at Brandywine, Paoli, and these other places, but he has received reinforcements, a Connecticut brigade from the Northern Army, New Jersey militia, Maryland militia have joined the army. Washington has basically replaced his losses in the campaign. And he has roughly 16,000 troops available. Now, how many of them are healthy is debatable, but on paper, there's about 16,000 of them, which means he outnumbers this force camped in Germantown, and Washington wants to attack. In fact, this attack that Washington's about to launch is the first time he took the main Continental Army in an attack against the main British Army. He hadn't done it before. Remember, Trenton and Princeton were against outposts. Every time else he fought was usually a defensive fight. He's not on the attack. This is the first time he will do it. So what's his plan? He's going to send 5 different columns down 5 different roads, marching all night in an attempt to hit this British camp simultaneously from 5 different directions. Ambitious. But let's break down those 5 columns. And I apologize if you don't know all the roads. I'm going to try to reference some local place names here for those of you that are familiar. So column 1 is commanded by William Smallwood, and it consists of Maryland militia and New Jersey militia. They have the farthest to go. So they're going to leave the camp around the Peter Wentz farm, march down Morris Road to Bethlehem Pike and turn right. Down Bethlehem Pike to where McGurk's Tavern is, It's a major intersection. So where I think it's St. Thomas Episcopal Church, hopefully I have the name of that church right, but there's an Episcopal church at this intersection where Route 73 and the Bethlehem Pike intersection intersects. So come down Morse Road to Bethlehem Pike, and then a left on Church Road, which is modern Route 73, and they're going to march all the way out to Old York Road, turn right, and they're going to come in on the far right flank of the British camp, just north of where the Stanton House is. Again, they are the farthest to go. The next column is commanded by Nathaniel Green. These are all Continental regulars. It is going to be 4 brigades of Virginia troops and a brigade of Connecticut troops. And here's the breakdown if you're into all those details. But they're going to initially follow Smallwood's column down Morris Road, Bethlehem Pike, turn at the church at Church Road, but they're going to turn right on Limekiln Pike, which is roughly where Acadia University is today. And they're going to come in on the right center of the British camp. All right, next column is John Sullivan's column. Again, it's 5 Continental brigades. This time it is 2, let me think about this for a second, 3 Pennsylvania brigades and the 2 Maryland brigades. They're going to come down, now they're on a different route. They're taking Route 73 or Skip Out Pike, again, to that crazy intersection where the church is. They're going to also turn on the Bethlehem Pike and not stay on Church Road. Go all the way down Bethlehem Pike to the village of Chestnut Hill, make a left on Germantown Avenue, and attack straight down Germantown Avenue. Next, following Sullivan in reserve, these are the backup guys, is Lord Sterling's division. It's the New Jersey Brigade and the North Carolina Brigade. Again, these are Continental regulars. All right, next column over is a brigade of Pennsylvania militia. It's James Potter's brigade, but John Armstrong, the militia division commander, is with this column. They're going to start near Norristown, march down Ridge Pike, or what was back then known as the Manatawny Road, all the way down into where Manayunk is today, to attack the far left of the British camp where the Wissahickon Creek empties into the Schuylkill River, roughly where Kelly Drive is today. And then the other Pennsylvania Militia Brigade is actually on the other side of the Schuylkill River. They're supposed to march down to the Middle Ferry. This is where 30th Street Station is today. To put on a big show and make the British think, or put on enough of a show to prevent Cornwallis from sending reinforcements into Germantown. Very complicated. Remember, no radios, no cell phones, no GPS. All this is happening in the middle of the night on narrow 18th century roads, and the only form of communication is riders on horseback. Now, if we were all sitting in the same room, I would ask you, do you think they pulled that off? Since I can't see your faces, I'm going to tell you they actually pulled that off. Within about 15 minutes of each other, let me back up a second. All these columns got to where they were supposed to be, shockingly, within about 15 minutes of each other. It's kind of a hard thing to believe, but they did pull that off. All right, now I'm going to briefly go through each column here and the initial success the Americans had, because initially everything went really well. So John Sullivan's division is the first one to attack, slightly ahead of Nathaniel Green's division. Initially led by Conway's brigade, Thomas Conway, hitting British picket posts of the 2nd Light Infantry Battalion on Mount Airy and driving them back. So some quotes here for you. This is Benjamin Talmadge, Light Dragoon officer. It says the troops were put in motion, and in a few moments the firing commenced. The outposts and advance guard of the enemy were driven in with great precipitation. This is Martin Hunter. He's an officer with these British light infantrymen. He says the day had broke about 5 minutes, but it was a very thick, foggy morning and so dark that we could not see 100 yards before us. Just as the battalion formed, the picket ran in and said the enemy were advancing in force. So after that initial overrunning of this picket post, Sullivan deploys all 5 of his brigades. You can see them fanning out here, and they are going to overwhelm the 2nd Light Infantry Battalion and most of the 40th Regiment of Foot that comes to their support. So again, some more quotes here. This is Enoch Anderson of the Delaware Regiment. He says, we pushed down all the fences in our front and marched to the battle. It was a very foggy morning. Bullets began to fly on both sides. Some were killed, some wounded, but the order was to advance. We advanced in line of the division. The firing on both sides increased, and what with the thickness of the air and the firing of guns, we could see but a little way before us. So you're going to hear there's a lot of references to the gunpowder smoke mixing with the early morning fog, making it very hard for both sides to see what they were shooting at. Back to Martin Hunter. He says, on our charging, they gave way on all sides, but again and again renewed the attack with fresh troops and greater force. We charged them twice till the battalion was so reduced by killed and wounded that the bugle sounded to retreat. Indeed, had we not retreated at the time we did, we should have been all taken or killed, as the columns of the enemy had nearly got around our flanks. The 2nd Light Infantry Battalion really didn't know what they were up against because of that morning fog and the smoke. They just kept seeing wave after wave of Continental troops coming out of this fog, even though they tried to put up a fight against the initial attacks. And that's what he's referencing there. This is Adam Hubley of Anthony Wayne's division, a Pennsylvania officer. He said, on our side, the left, the men behaved with the greatest bravery and repulsed the enemy, and with the charge of the bayonet, took their encampments and pushed them before us hard. This is Friedrich von Munchausen. He's a Hessian officer. He is a liaison for the Hessians on William Howe's staff. He actually was in Philadelphia that morning giving orders to Cornwallis when he heard the firing, and he hightailed it back up into Germantown. And he rode into this chaos. This is what he describes. He says he found the British held off the vehemently attacking enemy for a time, but they had to retreat after heavy losses. I arrived just at that time and was astounded to see something I'd never seen before, namely the English in full flight. All right, let's shift over. So that's Sullivan's attack going very well. All right, over here on the American right, you have Armstrong's militia hitting the left flank of the British camp. And just a couple quotes here. This is John Lacey of the militia. And he is pretty honest about it, that the militia didn't push that hard. Had they equally acted their part with that of the center, commanded in person by Washington, and pushed the enemy's flanks with spirit and alacrity as they ought to have done, they must have been preventing him forming a second line, as they did without opposition. And one of the Jaeger officers that he was up against, Johann Awald, writes, the Jaegers, of which only the picket had been engaged, counted 3 killed and 11 wounded, most of whom died from their severe wounds after several days. But I'm going to give the militia a little credit. Normally they get a bad rap, deservedly so. But if you're familiar with this terrain along the Wissahickon Creek, if you've ever driven along Kelly Drive here, this is a gorge surrounded by high cliffs on either side of the creek. There was no bridge here in the 18th century. So when the militia hit the top of this gorge, I honestly don't know how they were going to get across. So the fact that they don't turn this flank, I think, is more related to terrain than the fact they didn't make much of an effort. I don't know what they could have done. The Jaegers are on the other side of the gorge, picking at them with their Jaeger rifles. Just to give the militia a little bit of credit, anybody has an ancestor in the militia, this wasn't entirely their fault. Okay, let's move over to Green's column. They came down Limekiln Road. They're actually going to attack across the ground that is now LaSalle University, and they're going to hit the right center of the British camp with a lot of success. This is Charles Talbot. He's a Virginia sergeant. He says, we drove them immediately and so continued to drive them. We ran over their dead in great numbers. Who is this? Matthew Ankettle, British Light Infantry. He says the rebels moving on lined a bank and rail under cover of the fog. I'll explain this in a second. And threw in a most severe fire upon the 4th Regiment, which had been ordered to the left of the 1st Light Infantry and which knocked down almost the whole of the right wing. So what happened here, Russell's Virginia Brigade came down Church Lane here. And in the 18th century, that lane was sort of eroded away from years of wagon traffic. And there was a post and rail fence on the 2 banks of the road. And when Russell's brigade got down in this sort of hollow road, and they were looking under the fog above the bank. They could see the feet of these two battalions sort of above them. And they literally fronted in this road and laid their muskets on the bottom rail of the fence and fired a volley into the 1st Light Infantry and the 4th Regiment and knocked down like 50 of these guys, which in the 18th century for a volley to knock down 50 guys, that's a lot because of the inaccuracy of the weapons and et cetera. But that was a devastating volley, which helped collapse this front of the British here. This is John Marshall, who will go on to become Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, or as a young captain at the time. He said, the country through which the enemy was pursued abounded with strong and small enclosures, which everywhere broke the line of the advancing army. The darkness of the morning rendered it difficult to distinguish objects, even at an inconsiderable distance. So what Marshall's describing is the village of Germantown was linear. All the houses were lined up along what's today Germantown Avenue. And each of those houses had yards that extended perpendicularly off of Germantown Avenue. And all these yards and fields were fenced. So as the Americans are pushing in deeper into the village itself, they have to cross all these multitude of fence lines. And it was disrupting the formations as they were advancing. Okay, this is James Grant, perhaps the most pompous British officer. His writings are full of how great he is. And he writes, the attempt was bold, but when it came to the push, they failed totally in the execution. I was only uneasy for 10 minutes. He's full of crap. He was in command of the right wing of this British camp. His entire wing collapsed. This entire wing of the British camp was driven back to Germantown Road and beyond. Well, at least to the wing of Hocking Creek here and beyond the creek. So to say you were uneasy for just 10 minutes is not believable. Now, he wrote this after the battle when things changed in the British favor. So, you know, in hindsight, he could say that, but I guarantee he was a little scared for more than 10 minutes. This is Joseph Plum Martin. He's part of this attack, and he writes, many years after the war, he writes, we drove the British quite through their camp. They left their kettles in which they were cooking their breakfasts on the fires, and some of their garments were lying on the ground, which the owners had not time to put on. Affairs went on well for some time. The enemy were retreating before us. All right, and then one more British quote here. This is from an unidentified officer. He's also going to describe that volley from that hollow road. He says, the enemy's column following the road leading to Germantown, which run along the whole front of the 4th and probably not having seen the 1st Battalion, faced the fence and leaning their pieces on the bottom rail, for it was a hollow road in that part, fired on the 4th Regiment and knocked them down 50 men. All right, and then our last column we need to cover is the New Jersey and Maryland militia that came down the old York Road and hit the far right flank. Just a couple quotes here from these guys. This is Asher Holmes, New Jersey militia. He says, the Jersey militia and redcoats, I'll explain that in a second, and the Maryland militia drove the enemy when we first made the attack. The fire was very severe and the enemy ran. So one of the regiments attached to the New Jersey Militia Brigade was Foreman's Additional Continental Regiment, technically a Continental regular unit, but there was only like 50 guys. And Foreman commanded the New Jersey Militia Brigade, so he brought his regiment with him. They were referred to as redcoats because they were wearing captured British red coats. And hence the reference to them being in red coats. That regiment wasn't wearing blue or green or brown. All right, and then one from the British side. This is Richard Fitzpatrick, British Brigade of Guards. He remembered being surprised by their army coming down upon us and making a most desperate attack. Surprising indeed in every sense of the word, for we had not above 2 hours notice of their advancing and then gave no credit to it. So everything seems to be going well. So that begs the question, what went wrong? So during the chaos and the confusion of this initial assault, and you can see the Americans push. So there's this house, Clifton, Benjamin Chew's country estate, sits here on our map. You can see from this map, the Americans went past that. They started way up here and went past that house. And in the confusion and the fog and the smoke, Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Musgrave trying to prevent his regiment from being overrun and captured, ran inside this house with two of his companies, not the whole regiment, two companies. We're talking maybe 50 guys. Ran inside this house and started barricading the doors and windows. The Americans didn't know that in that confusion. Here's a picture of Musgrave. What he does here was so important to him that when he had this portrait painted, he had the house painted in the background. That's how big of a deal this was for him. So how do the Americans find out about it? This is Timothy Pickering. He's the Army's adjutant general. He's Washington's senior staff officer. And he recalls riding next to General Washington down the Germantown Road, up here, in the wake of Sullivan's advance when he heard a very heavy fire of musketry. In General Sullivan's divisions, it was evident, were warmly engaged with the enemy, but neither was in sight. So Washington and Pickering are coming down the road. They're not quite to Clifton, and they hear all the firing going on through the fog. They can't see it because of the fog, but they can hear a lot of discharge of muskets in front of them. And Washington doesn't like that, because if they can't see in the fog, those guys shooting can't see in the fog, and they're wasting ammunition. And he turns to Pickering and he says, "I'm afraid General Sullivan is throwing away his ammunition. They're wasting it. Ride forward and tell him to preserve it." So Pickering rides past the Chew House, or Clifton, to find Sullivan. He goes, "I rode 300 or 400 yards beyond Chew's house, met Sullivan, delivered the orders, and then he was going to ride back to Washington." But this time, when he rode back to ride to Washington, he gets shot at. And this is what he writes after the war. "The first notice I received of it," meaning the house, "was from the whizzing of musket balls across the road before, behind, and above me, as I was returning after delivering the orders to Sullivan. As he's riding, he looks to his right, and he saw the blaze of the muskets whose shot were still aimed at me from the windows of a large stone house standing back about 100 yards from the road." And if you look here, oops, let me go back here a second. I know this is hard to picture because these trees were not here in the 18th century. But this is Germantown Avenue. I'm standing basically across the street so I don't get hit by a car or a trolley. But you can kind of see through the trees here. Here's the house. So you got to imagine Pickering's riding down this road from the right to the left, and he gets shot at from the house. That's what he's describing. And when he returns to Washington, he finds Washington probably still mounted amongst other staff officers in the road here, in front of this house, the Bensel house. And this is a picture of it, still stands. And this you could see is above Clifton after he rode past the house. And there's an argument going on when Pickering shows up about what to do. And Pickering writes about it. The officers were discussing in Washington's presence this question: whether the whole of our troops then behind should immediately advance, regardless of the enemy in Chew's house, or first summon them to surrender. So should they keep pushing? The battle's not over. Should they keep pushing, or should they get those guys in that house to surrender? And Knox, the Army's chief of artillery, says it would be unmilitary to leave a castle in our rear. Now, I hope there's no Knox fans out there because I'm going to take a couple digs at Knox here. Knox is not a field commander. Knox does not command troops in the field. He's more of a logistical officer, commands the Army's artillery reserve. He basically got the job because he moved some cannon from Fort Ticonderoga to Boston early in the war. Now, that's a feat. I'm not taking that away from him. But because of that feat, he's made the Army's chief of artillery with no military background. He didn't go to one of the military schools. He didn't fight in the French and Indian War. He didn't serve in Europe or go to some fancy military school in Europe. He was a Boston bookseller that moved some guns. Washington trusts this guy. And he hears this argument: we can't leave this castle in our rear. Pickering responds, and he says, We are now in the midst of the battle, and its issue is unknown. In this state of uncertainty and so well secured as the enemy find themselves, they will not regard a summons. If you send a white flag up the driveway of that house, they will fire at your flag. And so they don't listen to Pickering. They're going to send an officer up the road with a white flag. And this is what Pickering writes later. I imagine they would pay no respect to the flag, they being well posted and the battle far enough from being decided. The event justified my apprehensions. In a few minutes, Lieutenant Colonel William Smith was brought back with his leg broken and shattered by a musket ball fired from the house. They sent Smith up the driveway with some kind of white rag tied to a stick or a sword, and they shot him in the leg. Smith will die from this wound a few days later. Now, the benefit of the doubt, the British smoke, fog, did they even see the white flag in that haze? Maybe not, because this is a very ungentlemanly thing to do. So benefit of the doubt, they might not have even seen the flag. They just seen an officer walk up the driveway and they shot. So the white flag didn't work. So now what they're going to do is they're going to place an artillery battery across the road from the house and start to pound the front of the house. Looks something like this. Now this house is thick stone. And the Americans don't have siege artillery with them. This is not naval guns they drug in the Germantown. These are field pieces. These are small guns, 4-pounders, 3-pounders, at the most 6-pounders. They are not capable of knocking down the stone walls of this house. What they are capable of doing is destroying all the fancy architectural decor around the house. They are going to blow off the legs and arms of the statuary. They're going to blow in the windows. They're going to blow the urns off the top of the house. They're going to blow in the front door, but they do not knock the walls of the house down. So that didn't work. So they decide to take the reserve division that was meant to go forward and reinforce Sullivan. And rather than reinforce Sullivan, the reserve division now deploys near Clifton with the North Carolinians of Francis Nash here and the New Jersey Brigade of William Maxwell, basically where the artillery is. Now, I don't think an order was actually given for this. I can't find any evidence of an actual order. I think the colonel of the 1st New Jersey, who I think is Elias Dayton off the top of my head, hopefully I have that right, charged up the driveway of the house. The 3rd New Jersey thought the order was given and followed the 1st New Jersey, but the 2nd and the 4th New Jersey did not charge. So 2 of the 4th New Jersey brigades charge up the driveway of this house to try to break into the house. And it's a disaster. They start getting picked off in the yard. And there's a lot of artwork depicting this. Here's one here. This is the one that's the cover of my book, trying to show them getting into the front of the house. This is a picture I took from inside the house, 2nd floor, looking out one of the 2nd-story windows, the view of the British that would have had into the front yard of the house, picking these guys off. This is a more modern image showing the British defending the inside of the house. You can see the bullet hole pock marks on inside the house here. So this doesn't work. So you've tried to summon it with a white flag. They tried to pound the house with artillery. They tried to charge the house with infantry. None of that worked. So your only remaining option is let's set a stone house on fire, because that'll work. All right, so here's another image. This time we see a wagon being pushed up to the side door of the house, loaded with straw to be set on fire. And one of the officers involved with this is John Lawrence. He's an officer in Washington staff. He is the son of Henry Lawrence, who will become president of Congress within the month, replacing John Hancock. So this is Henry Lawrence's son. And for his troubles, Lawrence will take a bullet through the shoulder, attempting to do this. Guess what? This didn't work either. But this is making a lot of noise. This is creating a lot of noise and confusion behind all the guys that advanced past this house. So now you have all these units out here starting to think, hey, what did we leave behind in the fog? And you start to see these units peeling away heading towards this commotion and sound in their rear, like this, relieving the pressure on the British, including McClanahan's brigade coming from Nathaniel Greene's command. Now, there's a myth out there that the British had artillery inside the house shooting artillery out the windows. No, they didn't. McClanahan's brigade artillery set up behind the house and started shooting at the back of the house, missed, and hit Americans on the other side of the house. So these American accounts that there's British shooting artillery out the windows, it's actually American artillery firing and missing from behind the house, hitting these guys. So you have a lot of friendly fire incidents as a result of this. You have Pennsylvania regiments shooting in the New Jersey regiments, Pennsylvania regiments shooting in the Virginia regiments, all in the smoke and fog of the battle. Checking my timing here. Okay. So because of all of that chaos, and now there's the pressure's relieved on the British are able to regroup. Many of the regiments reform, and they begin to counterattack and push back and retake their camps. And so some quotes here for you on this part of the battle. This is Anthony Wayne saying that they ran away from the arms of victory, ready and open to receive us. This is George Whedon, one of the Virginia Brigade commanders. He said, by some means or other, the right wing gave way, which encouraged the enemy to rally and press forward. The left shortly after was also broke, and a general repulse took place. Instead of a victory, the most important, had we attained it? This is, who is this? Unidentified officer, British Light Infantry. He said, the officers had load out, loudly charged. The enemy turned about, fired, and run forward through the camp. One of my lieutenants was mortally wounded, and a very few others pursued the enemy who were forming and threw down their arms. So Americans that had captured a bunch of British guys are now releasing those British guys and surrendering themselves. This is Thomas Sullivan, a corporal in the 49th of Foot, and he describes this. He says, after we fired the first volley, they ran towards the center, leaving the prisoners loose. So the Americans are releasing their prisoners. And those prisoners later formed immediately, picked their guns up off the ground, took to their arms, firing upon the enemy with the greatest ardor. The guys that had just been prisoners now got their guns back, took 63 of that party who, upon their approach, threw down their arms. So the guys that had just held them are now their prisoners. That's the chaos that was going on in Germantown. Musgrave's guys get released from the house. They come out and join the pursuit, and the Americans are driven off the field. They will retreat all the way to Schwenksville that night, where the Pennypacker Farm is, another Montgomery County historic site. They actually retreated farther than where they started from, because they started here in the Methacton Hills. They retreated past that. So think about this. They left between 7 and 9 p.m. on October 3rd, marched all night into Germantown, fought a sustained battle for about a half a day, then retreated all the way down Route 73 to Schwenksville. Some of these regiments, depending on what column they were in, marched 45 miles that day. And in the middle of it, fought a battle. I mean, it's just crazy when you stop and think about that. All right, I'll take your questions in a second, but if anybody's interested in having me speak, or I do tours, or would like a signed copy of one of my books that are pictured here, we can make that happen. In fact, my new one just came out this week. I just got my copies of it. This is an, those of you that aren't familiar, this is an illustrated, high gloss, a lot of image history of the campaign that Casemate Publishing just put out. It just came, I just got my copies this week. So this is hot off the presses. So questions, let me take your questions.
Let me see how I unmute everyone. So if anybody would like to ask a question of Mike, why don't you unmute yourself in the lower left corner and you know, raise your hand, ask your question. I do see one question in the chat from Ed Wimble. Let me see. You know, he says you didn't say anything about the death of Agnew, Michael.
Oh, that's fine. That's good. That's a fair question. I was trying to stick to my time here and not go too far over. That's a good question though. Let me go back here. So during this breakout, when the British broke out here, a couple high-ranking officers go down. I'll get to Agnew in a second. One of them is in this chaos, Francis Nash, who Nashville's named after, North Carolina Brigade Commander, is on his horse sitting next to Witherspoon. I think first name's James. His dad is the president of Princeton. Somebody help me. Do I have that right?
Witherspoon is, yeah, that's right about Witherspoon.
Yeah, so his son, I think it's James Witherspoon, and Nash are on their horses in Germantown Avenue. And an British artillery round comes bouncing down the road. That round went through the side of Nash's horse, ripped apart his left leg, eviscerated it, and then slammed into the side of Witherspoon's head, killing him. And all this bloody mass collapsed in the road of Germantown Avenue. Nash, they cut the rest of his leg off and get him out from underneath the horse. Survives this for like, forget how many days, it's 4 or 5 days. He survives that before dying. He's now buried up in Towamencin, where Towamencin meeting is. In fact, it's the same cemetery that Lieutenant Colonel Smith that was wounded during the white flag thing, he's in the same cemetery. All right, now the Agnew thing, so around the same time as that, as the British are regrouping and starting to push, Agnew jumps out. He's one of the brigade commanders for Kniphausen's wing. He jumps out into Germantown Avenue trying to see what's going on because of all the confusion. And an American popped out from behind one of the buildings and shot him in the small of his back, in the lower part of his back. They get him back to a house called Grumblethorpe on the lower end of Germantown. It's back this way, where he will die, I think, later that day. I don't think he survives that day. I think I have that right. Either way, it's a mortal wound. He's then buried in the, well, we could debate whether his body's actually there or not, but he's buried, I can't think of the name of the family burial, the Benneville family burial ground. Hopefully that answered your question, whoever that was.
Yeah, thank you, Mike.
Mm-hmm.
Other questions, you can unmute yourself if you like in the lower left corner and ask. I have a question for you, Mike.
Yeah, go ahead.
So what about the reinforcements that marched out of Philadelphia during the battle? Did they get involved?
Yes and no. By the time Cornwallis actually gets up into Germantown, the retreat of the Americans has already started. Now they do join the pursuit, but all the evidence I could find, they were barely engaged in that. They basically joined the pursuit column and not heavily engaged like the other regiments were that were camped there. Basically involved with some of the skirmishing with the retreating American forces.
Yeah.
I do see somebody corrected me, and you're probably right because I wasn't sure off the top of my head. Matthias Ogden probably is the colonel of the 1st New Jersey. I just didn't know that off the top of my head without checking my notes. So thank you, whoever said that in the chat.
How about some other questions from the audience?
Mike, the feint by the middle ferry, was that the least effective part of the battle?
Yeah, the only I don't know of a source within that militia brigade that talks about it. At least not one I'm familiar that I've been able to find. There is a civilian account, Robert Morton from Philadelphia, that mentions it, but he basically blows it off and says Cornwallis ignored it, formed up his reinforcing column, and left the city. So that civilian reference makes me think it did nothing to stop Cornwallis. But there's very little concrete info on that specific column. Does that answer your question, Tom?
Yeah, No, that's pretty much what I remember, but I was just trying to get confirmation on it.
Yeah,
It's not an easy place to cross the river.
no.
Hey, we've got a couple of questions in chat here. Bob Wong asks, was Musgrave celebrated and promoted? Did he gain notoriety from the British for his stand at the Chew Mansion?
Yeah, it's a big deal. He also, yeah, he gets a lot of notoriety. He actually ends up commissioning these medals, which you'll find sometime pop up on collector sites. He commissioned medals. One side shows the Chew House, the other side has the date and the Battle of Germantown on it, and he issued it to every member of the regiment. The officers, I believe, I'd have to go back and double check my notes. But I think the officers got gold versions, and the enlisted men got, I think they were copper versions, if my memory serves. But every now and then you'll see one pop up. I've seen them in a couple different museums. I mean, there was enough of them made that they're around. So it was a big deal. Yeah, his name rose in the British ranks.
Wasn't it also true that he really had to make this stand there to expunge the disgrace he felt for his unit surrendering Nassau Hall during the Battle of Princeton?
I don't know if that went through his head at that moment.
I thought he actually made some exclamation like, you disgraced me at Nassau Hall, so you bastards better stand here and die where you are. Something like that.
I've never found that. There isn't, in fact, there's not a known source from anybody that was in the house that day writing about what happened.
Well, Musgrave was in the house.
Yeah, but where's that source at?
Okay.
I mean, I'm not saying it doesn't exist. I've never seen it.
Yeah.
Mike, I have a question.
If you know the source, I'd be happy to be familiarized with it, but I don't know of that source.
Yeah.
Mike, I have a question.
Yeah.
Joe Robuski. I'm looking at your map. I'm curious, why is Hal there as opposed to being in Philadelphia, which was his original prize? Like, why wasn't Cornwallis up where Hal is at the beginning of the battle and Hal back in Philadelphia?
That's a good question. He doesn't ever really say. My guess is this was the vulnerable, for lack of a better word, flank of the city. So Philadelphia was exposed on the northern side. There were no defensive barriers on the northern part of the city yet. Because you have the two rivers forming the bottom part of a triangle. All right. But this open part up here, there was no natural defensive point for him to place his units. So this is more of like, again, this is my inference. This was an outpost to protect the city while they were building this line of redoubts that would be built roughly along what's today's Spring Garden Street. But they're not done yet. In fact, at this point, I'm not even sure if they had been started yet, but I have to go back and look at my notes. They weren't done yet. And so he wanted to hold this outpost until that was completed, and then everybody was going to be withdrawn into the city. So again, this is just my inference. Because this was the vulnerable part of the army, he wanted to be with that part of the army.
Okay, so he felt he knew the best to be out.
Yeah, and that's just my guess. See, the problem with the Hal stuff is we don't have his personal papers. They are, let me think about this. They are burned by his wife when he dies. So we don't know his personal correspondence. The only stuff we have that he wrote is official correspondence to the king or Lord Germain, or his testimony before Parliament when he resigns and goes home. The problem with either of those sources is he's not going to admit to his mistakes.
Yeah.
So he's not going to tell the king, oh, I screwed up here. He's going to he's going to paint the best picture for the king. And when he goes before Parliament, he's going to do the same thing. So those aren't the most reliable sources for knowing what was really going through his head.
Okay.
Yeah.
I thought the papers were the family home burnt like
Yeah.
1830 something.
I get him and Cornwallis confused. Whose wife died while they were alive?
Cornwallis.
Cornwallis's.
All right, so that's why it's not, isn't it Cornwallis's house that burns?
No,
No,
it's
it's
Hal.
Hal's
I
house
get the
burns
two
in
confused
Ireland.
because one of them, the wife burned the letters.
Uh,
It was Mary or Mrs. Washington.
Well, I know she did it.
Yeah.
I know Mary
Well,
did.
there's actually a lot. There's a lot of couples where their personal stuff was
Because
burnt. But,
Cornwallis's papers are gone too. I
uh,
thought one of them was the wife and one of them was a house fire.
I
yeah,
thought
the house fire is definitely Hal.
weren't some papers actually discovered at Stenton up in the attic?
Not that I'm aware of.
From
Hal
the,
paper?
Yes,
No, Penn's
That was his
papers
headquarters.
and Logan's papers were discovered there,
Right.
but
It's
I don't
Stenton?
know that any British papers relating to the Revolution were there at all. Doesn't mean they weren't, but I've never heard of them.
Yeah, I never heard that. All right. Was there another question in the chat? I thought there was. Let me check again.
Yeah, there's one from Ed.
Was there something about Stephen? Oh, yeah. So I don't want to say Stephen was made a scapegoat. I think there's more to that story than being made a scapegoat. So for those of you that aren't familiar, Stephen's going to be court-martialed for drunkenness during the battle in the aftermath and kicked out of the army. But I think there's more to this than that. So 4 generals are court-martialed in the weeks following Germantown. William Maxwell for drunkenness at Couch's Bridge in Brandywine. Maxwell. Anthony Wayne for what happened at Paoli. John Sullivan for they blamed him for Brandywine. And then Stephen's going to be court-martialed. The other 3 are all exonerated.
Yeah.
Stephen is not. Stephen's accused of drunkenness and not being with his troops. Both of which are probably true, but in an army full of drunks, how do you single out a single drunk? There's more to this. So keep in mind that when Lafayette, and again, this is just, I haven't been able to hard prove this because the primary sources don't hard prove it. But let me give you my theory. Lafayette joins the army with a lot of money for the cause, a 2-star general with no command. When he gets wounded at Brandywine, he's not commanding any troops there. So he goes off to Bethlehem to recover from that wound. He rejoins the army in early November. Around the same time, the Stephen court-martial is being finalized. Isn't it sort of shocking that Stephen gets removed from the army and Lafayette gets his division?
Well.
You can't tell me that there's not a connection there.
or the fact that Stephen was Washington's main rival back in the old Virginia days at Fort Necessity and stuff like that.
I mean, yes, all that's true. I mean, yes, that's all true. But I mean, I don't know how you kick Stephen out of the army when you could argue that Wayne's disaster at Paoli was worse. Like with all the stuff that's going on in the campaign, that's the guy you throw out of the army.
Yeah, well, Stevens wasn't a Washington man, whereas Wayne was.
Yeah. So, hey, one of the things I really enjoyed about your talk, Michael, was you pointing out against what historians normally point out, that Washington did pull it off. Those columns all arrived about when they were supposed to. Many people say, oh, it was too complex a plan. But in fact, you know, he brought all those people together at the right place at the right time. And that's, I think that's a great observation.
It was the same plan as Trenton.
Yes, it was. But keep in mind, at Trent, not all the columns got across the river.
Yeah.
Right. Well, some didn't and some did, but I mean,
Yes,
Armstrong didn't get across the Wissahickon.
true.
Wow.
I think Smallwood got lost too, didn't he?
No, he ended up there.
Smallwood got the right word. That's most previous books. In fact, I would argue all of them make it sound like Smallwood didn't do anything. But there's too much primary source documentation saying that they attacked.
Yeah.
I mean, every book, McGuire's book, I mean, you go through all the previous Philadelphia campaign books, they all make it sound like that column never even engaged. But
That
there's
was
too
my
many,
impression.
there's too much primary source material saying that they engaged.
Yeah.
I just have one comment, Mike.
Yeah,
They are great maps that you use to illustrate this. I was really taken with those maps.
they're the ones from my book.
Well, you have, whoever did your maps, they did great maps.
Well, thank you. They weren't cheap.
If you haven't seen Mike's book, Germantown and Military History, The Battle for Philadelphia, October 4, 1777, it's well worth seeking out and picking up. Really great read and long overdue to have really substantial work on the Battle of Germantown. So we really appreciate it.
Yeah, and for those of you, just to kind of sum up, and I'll let Bob finish up here. Just those of you that don't know me real well or haven't heard already, I'm actually working on a third volume that's going to cover post Germantown to Valley Forge. So it'll cover, actually most of it's written. It's going to cover heavily the fighting along the Delaware, the fighting at White Marsh, Matson's Ford. I'm in the home stretch. I probably have 2 chapters left to write.
Right.
So that's hopefully going to be, with some luck, a manuscript done next year.
So maybe publication in 25, you think, or 24?
Yeah, I mean, I never know how to judge that. I'm hoping to have the manuscript done by the end of the summer, since that's my goal. Within the editing usually takes 6 months. I mean, it could be next fall, but I don't want to promise that.
Looking forward to seeing that.
Bob, before I leave, can I give a little talk about what we're doing in September?
Oh, yeah, please do. And I'd like to show, if I can, I'm going to share my screen here. Let me find it. Here we go. Yeah, go ahead, Joe.
Oh, yeah, I mean, I
Yeah,
probably need to stop.
Mike has to unshare.
Yeah, I got it. Here you go.
Okay, so up there, oh, you had it.
I don't know where I went. Let me go back and put it back up. Hold on. I'll do that again in just a moment.
Okay, well, when Bob gets up on September 17th, it's a Sunday at 1 o'clock, I'll be giving my presentation on Annis Boutno Stockton. The title is The Poet and the General. And it's being held at Morven. As Bob said, we're going live. Also, it's going to be Zoom, so I guess we call it a hybrid. Okay, there it is. So I'm a volunteer docent at Morven. I've been there for, I don't know, 12, 13 years now. And I got them to let us give it at the Stockton Education Center. So if anybody wants to come to see it in person, the presentation is free. And after the presentation, probably around 2:30 or so, I'll give a tour of Morven. I'll give my talk. If you haven't been there before, or if you haven't been there in a while, it's changed. And the only thing about that, if you want to go into the museum, the normal fee is $10. I got them to get us a senior citizen fee. So even if you're not a senior, if you tell me you're with the Washington's Crossing Roundtable, they'll give you the $8 fee. So anyway, I just wanted to say that it'll be our first live, and also it'll be Zoomed at the same time. Anything you want to add, Bob?
No, you can see we've got, a couple more presentations coming up also in December and in following March. We've got those lined up. Hope you're able to join us. And I want to
Just one other thing. The thing you were talking about in November, the roundtable meeting.
Oh, right.
They're also going to be at Morven too. I think they got
Yes.
Joe Ellis to come and give a talk.
Correct.
Yeah.
Okay, so you'll get, if you want, you can be at Morven twice this fall.
The American Revolution Roundtable Congress, which is a consortium of many of the roundtables, mostly on the East Coast, meets every 2 years to talk about how do we work together how do we improve our groups. And they're going to be meeting for a couple days in mid-November in Princeton and at Morven. So those of you who are interested, you should hear more from me about that in our group. Looking forward to it. And we're going to do some tours and all. So hopefully we'll do a 10 Crucial Days tour of the Washington Crossing area, including Princeton, and then also a tour of the Swan Foundation collection at Washington Crossing. I hope you can join us for those. Michael, thank you very much. This was a great presentation. I really appreciate it.
Wonderful.
It was good, Mike, and I like the changes, the little tweaks you made.
Yeah. Well, thank you,
Great.
everyone.